Okay, hello class. So I said at the beginning of this class, we're going to work on two skills. One is called critical thinking, the other one is called inventive thinking. And critical thinking has to do with making a judgment about other people's arguments. Or another way of saying it is evaluating other people's arguments. Inventive thinking has to do with inventing your own arguments. And you know, an argument is a conclusion or a claim being made on the basis of some premises. The premises and the conclusion together, that's called an argument. So this evaluative process, this critical thinking process is a skill. And like any skill, you have to practice exercises, like in sports or in music. You don't get better at playing football by reading books on football, or play the flute by reading books on playing the flute. So you have to do exercises. And that's why I really urge you to do the exercises in the book, at least the ones with the stars on it that have answers in the back of the book so you can check your answers. So critical thinking has to do with evaluating other people's arguments. Now, part of that process, an important part, is to ask yourself if that argument that you're hearing or the argument you're reading is a deductive argument. If it is, if you think it is, then we need to translate it into standard form. That's chapter 7. We haven't gotten there yet. Well, we're getting there kind of slowly in steps, but chapter 7 is devoted all to translating arguments from ordinary language into standard form. Then once you get it into standard form, we want to take it into symbolic form or abbreviated form. Okay, let's call it symbolic, let's call it abbreviated form, because symbolic logic is another thing. So we go from ordinary language into standard form. With standard form, it means the major premise is in the right place, comes first, minor premise comes second, and then the conclusion. It also means there's only 3 terms: a subject term, a predicate term, and a middle term. And it means that the subject and predicate term are in the conclusion. The predicate term of the conclusion is in the major premise. The subject term of the conclusion is in the minor premise. And then the middle term is either, in figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, or figure 4. So you need to know those figures. And it also means that it's in an A, that each of these propositions, the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion, are standard form categorical propositions. That is either A, E, I, or O. That way you could name the mood and the figure, okay? So this is the big process we went over last time. You go from ordinary language to standard form, where you still have content, and then you go into either, you could call it symbolic form or abbreviated form. Then we test to see if the syllogism is valid. If it's valid, that means the reasoning process is correct. That doesn't mean it's sound. Remember, validity only means that the conclusion follows on the basis of the premises. But it doesn't say the premises are true. It doesn't say the conclusion is true. In fact, all the premises could be false, and the conclusion could be false, and the whole thing is still valid, okay? People in logic all know that, and anybody that's taken a course in logic knows that. But in ordinary parlance, when somebody says, well, that's a valid argument, what they mean is it's persuasive. But properly speaking, validity means the reasoning process is correct. It doesn't mean the propositions are true. If the propositions are all true, the premises are true, the conclusion is true, and it's valid, then it's sound. That's the best thing you can say about a deductive argument. And remember, only deductive arguments are either valid or invalid. Inductive arguments are either highly probable or less probable. If they're high probable, that means they're strong. And then if they're less probable, it means it's weaker. So the beauty of deductive argument is that you're drawing forth a new truth from an already established truth. In fact, that's the very word deduction. If you look up the etymology of the word deduction, it comes from D, which means forth or from, and then the infinitive ducere, D-U-C-E-R-E, it means to draw. So when you're engaging in deductive reasoning, you're drawing forth a new truth from an already established truth. So forensic medicine is based on that. When people investigate crime scenes, they're very careful not to mess up the crime scene, because anything left at the crime scene, they could use deductive reasoning to generate clues to who's the perpetrator, to moving forth with the investigation. So investigative criminal investigation is based on that. Science uses it to a certain extent. It's ubiquitous. It's used a lot. This is deductive reasoning. We're studying classical deductive reasoning. Then there's symbolic logic. That's a whole nother thing. It's based on this, but it's further development. So what I'm saying now is that this evaluative process of critical thinking is based in part on determining whether or not the argument, the deductive argument, is valid. If it's valid, that's good. It means the premises are actually supporting the conclusion, and the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises, that the reasoning process is correct. But it doesn't mean that it's sound. In order for it to be sound, the premises have to be true, and the conclusion has to be true, and it also has to be valid. Okay. So we're just working on testing now. What I wanted to focus on in this lecture is the Venn diagram method for testing the validity of syllogisms. So we're going to take passages that are almost in ordinary language, in standard form. The propositions are mixed up, so we have to put it in standard form. But in ordinary language, it's going to be embedded so completely in language. And you're going to have to learn from chapter 7 how to extract the deductive argument. It might not even be a deductive argument, but you try to translate that into standard form, then put it into symbolic form, and then you can test the validity. Now, there's 3 methods of testing the validity of syllogisms. One is called the Venn diagram technique. That's my favorite, and it's the most telling. And you learn a lot about syllogisms by using it, the Venn diagram technique. But there's another method we're going to work on next time, and that's called the rules method. There are 6 rules, and some of them are easy, but 3 of them are based on your understanding of distribution. That's why I wanted you to know about A, E, and I and O propositions, on what terms are distributed and what terms are not. So that's the rules method. Works like this. There are 6 rules. You learn these 6 rules. You put your syllogism in standard form. If it doesn't break any rule, it's valid. If it breaks a rule, it's invalid. And if it does break a rule, you need to know the name of the rule, of the transgression. There are rules, there are names for these faults, these breaking of rules. The other technique is called the coined name method. This was invented during the Middle Ages by monks. And what they did was they realized that since there's only 4 figures and there are only 4 standard form categorical propositions, that there are 64 possible syllogisms. Well, there's an infinite number of syllogisms once you instantiate, put content into the form. But when in terms of form alone, there are only 64. Of those 64, there are only 15 that are valid. So what these monks did is came up with 15 names in Latin, where the vowels of the names represent the propositions of the syllogism. And they had 4 for figure 1, 4 for figure 2, 4 for figure 3, and 3 for figure 4. And they just remembered those names that go with those figures. For example, Barbara is figure 1. They took the A, the A, the A. There's 3 A's in the name Barbara. The A, and they knew that Barbara goes with figure 1. There are only 4 names that go with each, 4 with figure 1, 4 for figure 2, 4 for figure 3, 3 for figure 4. That makes 15. So Barbara is an A, that's the mood of that syllogism, and it's a 1 because Barbara goes with 1. And then they just remember that all Barbara, all A1 syllogisms are valid. So whatever you put in there, whatever content, that's why I was emphasizing instantiation. Instantiation means putting content into form. So instead of P, you put like the practice of music or something. And so whatever content you put in there, it'll still be valid. Okay, so let's go over, we're working on chapter 6 now, and this is the final phase of part 1 of this course. I want you to learn how to go from ordinary language, that's going to be chapter 7, we'll work on that next time, and then put it into standard form categorical syllogism. And then from there, we're going to put it into symbolic form. This is not symbolic logic, but we're putting a syllogism into symbolic form. Then we're going to test it, and I want to go over 3 methods with you. This Venn diagram, we'll do that today. Then I'll make another lecture on the rules. And the name method, you just have to remember these 15 names and know that 4 go with figure 1. That takes, just do it 4 at a time. Like Barbara, you know, what are they now? I have them memorized, but we're not doing that now. Dari, that's another one. Darie, Darie. But we'll do those next time. That sounds like a waste of time memorizing these names, but it's going to be very helpful when you actually construct syllogisms to have those names in your mind, because then you could just say, okay, I know an AAA1 is valid. Let me instantiate that, and I can use that as an argument. Okay, so let's say you're listening to someone talk and they say, well, I was driving home from work the other day and I stopped at a red light, and the car ahead of me had a bumper sticker. So I drove a little closer so I could read it, and it said, music makes you smarter. And as I was waiting for the red light, I started thinking, well, why does music make you smarter? Then I realized, as a nursing student in my course in neurophysiology, that whatever stimulates the corpus callosum makes you smarter. I know I used this example before, but sometimes it helps to have one example that, okay, so then I start connecting that with other things that I know from my education. And I remember some research people did how music, the practice of music, and even the listening of music stimulates the corpus callosum. And I thought, oh, that's how music makes you smarter. It stimulates the corpus callosum. I can use that in a speech that I want to give to the university about preserving the music and art departments, even during times where we're in a financial crunch. Because, you know, that's the first thing that goes usually is music and art. And so let's say you're giving a speech and you want to give some arguments about why we should preserve music. And part of one argument will be that the practice of music makes people smarter. So if that's what we're all about here, then we shouldn't get rid of the music department. Or you could even say it in a rhetorical question. Should we then get rid of the music department, the very activity that makes people smarter? You see how a rhetorical question could be a powerful way of persuasion once you've established the premises. You could use an enthymeme. Okay, so let's take that now from ordinary language and put it into standard form. And then we'll go from standard form to symbolic form, and then we'll test it by means of the Venn diagram technique. So that's why I had you learn how to diagram A propositions, E propositions, I propositions, and O propositions. You have to become skillful at that. As soon as you see an A, the hardest one, like I said last time, was the A. if I say all S is P, I mean there's no S that's not a P, so I have to cross out all the S's. If I say no S is P, I have to cross out the place where the S's and P's cross in the two circles that interlace. If I say some S is P, I put an X where it's S, but it's not a P. S, then it's also a P in that space. We went over that last time. And if I say some S is not P, I have to put an X in the S's that are not P's. Why I use X's for S and O propositions, and I color out things for A and E propositions, because only particular propositions have existential import. What that means is I'm positing the existence of at least one entity, that entity exists. But in A and E propositions, I'm only talking about inclusion, exclusion of classes. I'm not talking about the existence of entities. That's why one is an X and one is crossing things out. All right, so how does that argument, what to do now to go? We're going to learn all about going from ordinary language to standard form. But the first thing to do, we can touch, that's chapter 7. But what we can do is start learning that already. What you do is look for the conclusion. This one is easy. The practice of music makes you smarter. If I see a bumper sticker and it says music makes you smarter, then if I want to make two classes of that, music means the practice of music. Or it could mean listening to music too, but let's just assume that it means practicing music. And then makes you smarter, that's an adverbial clause. So you have to turn it into a category or a class. So let's turn it into the class of activities that make you smarter. So now it sounds like this. The practice of music is, now we have our copula, because if I just say music makes you smarter, there's no verb to be there. It's implicit in makes. Like I told you, all verbs presuppose to be. So music is an activity that makes you smarter. So music is the subject term, and activity that makes you smarter is the predicate term. Is called the copula. Now, we're not talking about some music. Like if I say music makes you smarter, I don't mean some music. I mean all music. It may not be true that all music makes you smarter. Maybe only classical or jazz or who knows. But when I say music makes you smarter, what I mean there in context is all music makes you smarter. So now it turns into an A proposition. And you know that that's the conclusion, that all music makes you smarter. So now what do we have? All the practice of music is an activity that makes you smarter. Okay, so that's our conclusion. Now the next thing you do, so the first thing to do is find the conclusion and then turn it into standard form. All music is an activity that makes you smarter. Now you have your subject term of your conclusion and you have your predicate term of your conclusion. What's the subject term? The practice of music. What's your predicate term? An activity that makes you smarter. Now the next thing to do is find the predicate term of the conclusion and look for any other proposition that contains that term. That's going to be your major premise. That has to go first. There's a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. The conclusion is going to have a subject and predicate term. The major premise is going to have a predicate term and a middle term. The minor premise is going to have a subject term and a middle term. Okay. So the next thing to do then is to find the predicate term of the conclusion. Whatever other proposition contains that, that'll be your major premise. Well, we know that the predicate term is an activity that makes you smarter. Now, if we go back to the context, so that whatever other proposition contains that, that's going to be your major premise, like I just said. Well, the proposition that contains that is whatever stimulates the corpus callosum is an activity that makes you smarter. That's what she learned from her physiology class, remember, in the context. So now we have our major premise. Whatever stimulates the corpus callosum is an activity that makes you smarter. So now we have our middle term. Whatever stimulates the corpus callosum, it's part of your brain. If you're doing something that stimulates that, you're going to get smarter. So now you have your major premise. The next thing to do is, this is sort of, you don't need to do this actually because it's already given, but just to be systematic, you find your subject term of your conclusion, which is music, the practice of music. Whatever other proposition contains that, there's only other one left. So, but still, you should go through this process because in ordinary language, things are embedded and it's harder to find it. The examples on page 204 and 205, it's almost in standard form. It's not going to be this hard. It's just you have to put them in the right order. So I would work some of those problems. We'll do some today. But once you learn chapter 7 a little bit better, then these arguments are going to be embedded in ordinary language more deeply, and it's going to be take a little more skill to extract them and put them into standard form. Okay, so now you look to the subject term of your conclusion, which is music or the practice of music, and you find music is something that stimulates the corpus callosum. So that's going to be your minor premise. So now you have it in standard form. All things that stimulate the corpus callosum, what is an activity that makes you smarter. It's your major premise. The practice of music, subject term, stimulates the corpus callosum. Whatever stimulates the corpus callosum, that's your middle term. So the practice of music is an activity that makes you smarter. Now we have our syllogism. We've taken it from ordinary language, we've put it into standard form. So it turns into all M is P. Now, this next process, Copy doesn't give it a name. I'm naming it because I want you to go through this process. And if you do this process, things become much easier. So once you have it in standard form, you still have content there. You're still talking about music, the corpus callosum, how it makes you smarter, but we're moving away from content towards abstract to form, symbolic form. See, the more you can formalize things, the easier it is to manipulate the logical structure of things. When we go the other way, in the second part of the course, we're going to go from form to content. Now we're going from content to form. And that's the way critical thinking works. Okay, so now we want to formalize it. We want to put the content in brackets. And it doesn't matter about the corpus callosum, doesn't matter about music, none of those things. It's just, is the reasoning process correct? Remember, that's logic is the study of the principles and methods used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. Well, this is a method. It's called the Venn diagram method. We're trying to find out whether or not this is correct reasoning. If it's correct, that means it's valid. If it's incorrect, it's invalid. Well, it turns into an AAA1. And you need to be able to name the mood and figure because the major premise is an A. All M is P. And the minor premise is an A. All S is M. And the conclusion is an A also. All S is P. Notice what we've done. Instead of talking about music, the corpus callosum, things that makes you smarter, we've put those in brackets. And we're just talking about S, P, and M. There's always going to be just S, P, and M, where the S is the subject of your conclusion. And it's going to appear in the minor premise too. The P is the predicate term of the conclusion. It's going to appear in the major premise. The M is going to appear once in the major premise and once in the minor premise. Depending on its position, it's going to determine whether it's figure 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it looks like this. It's an AAA1. It happens to be Barbara, the 3 A's. And there it is. You can see it right here. It's an A, and because of the positioning of that middle term, it's a 1. Okay, so it's an AAA1. Now, how do I use the Venn diagram technique? Now, this is important. I want you to remember what I'm saying right now. If you have a remember there's universal, there's only two quantities of categorical propositions. One is universal and one is particular. So A and E's are universal. And then there's only two qualities. There's affirmative and negative. In life, there's a lot of qualities, right? But in logic, it's just, in this kind of logic, there's only two. There's negative and affirmative. Okay. So an A is universal affirmative, an E is universal negative, an I is particular and it's affirmative, and O is particular and negative. If, when you're diagramming the syllogism, you always diagram the universal proposition first. This is important. It was important to me because I messed up my first logic test because I didn't know this, and now I know it. So I'm. If you have a particular and a universal, you do the universal one first, because if you do the particular one first, you won't know where to put the X, and it will screw up the whole process. Now, here's the beauty of the syllogism. There's something beautiful about this too. I mean, sunrises and, mountain ranges are beautiful, and rivers. But abstract things can be beautiful too, like in mathematics and in logic. What's beautiful about this is if you diagram the major and minor premise, the conclusion is already diagrammed. This is the main point. If you miss this, then you don't understand how this Venn diagram technique is working. Let me say it again. If you diagram the major and minor premise, and then you back off, your work is done. If the conclusion is already diagrammed after having diagrammed the major and minor premise, then it's valid. If you diagram the major and minor premise and the conclusion is not already diagrammed, then it's invalid. What does that tell you? Use your thinking. It goes right back to the word deduction. You're drawing forth a conclusion from an already, you're taking something implicit and making it explicit. Deducere, you're drawing it forth. If it's valid, you're drawing forth a new truth from an already established truth. If I find a hair at a crime scene and it's gray, I can deduce from that it's probably an older person. It might be premature graying. Then they can go into the laboratory, find out exactly how old that person was. How is it from one hair they know how old a person is? Or maybe just a cell of a hair under the microscope. Scientists can tell how old that person is, if it's a man, if it's a woman. They're using deductive reasoning. Okay, so you're drawing forth a new truth. So this is the whole process. You diagram the major and minor premise. If the conclusion is already diagrammed, then it's valid. Okay, so you make 3 circles, like the Olympic circles, right? And it always has to be this way. The subject term must always be there. Predicate term must, the middle term always down there. Don't mix those up. And then in this case, they're both A propositions, so you don't have to worry about one being universal. They're both universal, so you can diagram any one first. So let's just start with the first one. All M is P. All M is P. So what that means is there's no M that's not a P. So I crossed out all the M's that are not P's. You see down here? Then the minor premise says all S is M. What that says is if there is any S's, they're going to be M's. So I have to cross out all the S's that are not M's. Now, my work is done as a diagrammer. I've diagrammed the major and minor premise. Then what did I tell you? If it's valid, the conclusion's already diagrammed. If it's not already diagrammed, that means it's invalid. Well, All S is P. All the S's that exist in that space right there, see that space is empty. That means if there are any S's, they're going to be P's. Those are S's and they cross with P's. All the S's are crossed out except for the S's that are P's. So that means it's valid. That argument is valid. Now the next step, I'm not going to ask you to do this on the test, but this is important for life. When you're evaluating that argument, you have to ask if those premises are true. Is it true that music stimulates the corpus callosum? Well, you can find out. You can go and Google it. Find out some scientific research, something that's a bona fide scientific research that's published in journals of science. And they have studies that are done. And you can find whether or not that's true proposition. And is it true that whatever stimulates the corpus callosum helps to make people smarter? I think you can find that in neurophysiology. You know, if that's true, then it's a sound argument. Now you got something. You have an argument that's sound, it's valid, and it's true. All the propositions are true. And you can use it. Now, when you use it, you don't want to talk like that. You'd sound like a cyborg. That's where your knowledge of classical rhetoric comes in, and you try to speak eloquently. And you embed that into flowing, fluid language where it's, and for that, that's another study of how to speak and how to write. You can study classical rhetoric, and you can listen to speakers who are great speakers. Listen to speeches that are great speeches, like Eleanor Roosevelt and Martin Luther King Jr., people like that. All right, let's do some more. Let's do a couple more, just to make sure. So the more, this is a skill, and like any skill, you have to practice. If you don't do exercises, you just have it theoretically. So let's just do a couple more, and then we'll work on, there's some good exercises on page 204 and 205. There's one on page 205. I'm using I finally got my 15th edition. So it came in. And so on page 204 and 205, the 15th edition of Copy. Let's see, number 6. This one caught my eye. So it says, number 6 is on page 205. It says, no criminals were pioneers. So that one jumped out at me because I know that many of the pioneers were criminals. So that statement is false, but it still can be valid. So that's why, in fact, we're going to find out it is valid. But let's go through the process. So that's the reason I chose that one is that's a good example of something that's valid but not true. Some of the pioneers were criminals, okay? And so that statement is not true. So the whole thing could be valid and it's not sound because that proposition is not true. But let's determine whether or not it's valid or not, and we'll use the Venn diagram method. No criminals were pioneers, for all criminals are unsavory persons, and no pioneers were unsavory persons. So that it's almost in standard form. Okay, so all you got to do is find out what is the conclusion and then get the predicate term of the conclusion, whatever other proposition contains that, it's going to be your major premise. And let's put it in standard form. Well, the conclusion is no criminals were pioneers. And the word pioneers is the predicate term of the conclusion. So you have to find whatever other proposition contains that. Well, no pioneers were unsavory persons. Instead of were, we always just use the word is when you're going to standard form. Take every form of the verb to be, and even if it's implicit, you just use the word is. So the grammar is going to be all messed up. But we allow that to happen because we're trying to find the reasoning process if it's correct or not. So it turns into no pioneers are unsavory person. You can use are, so it doesn't sound like you're breaking the rule of grammar, because no pioneers are unsavory or were, you can use past tense. But it's, when you go into symbolic form, just use the word is. It's called the copula. And then you look to the predicate term of the conclusion, which is criminals. No criminals were pioneers. That's the conclusion. So criminals is the subject term of your conclusion. Find whatever other proposition contains that. So it says all criminals are unsavory persons. How did I know that no criminals were pioneers was the conclusion? Well, the word for is there. Let's read it in context. No criminals were pioneers, for all criminals are unsavory persons, and no pioneers were unsavory persons. See the word for, that's your premise indicator. Remember, we looked at that, we studied that. And you just use your common sense. Ask yourself what this person is trying to claim. They're saying no criminals were pioneers. Okay. So now you have it in standard form. No pioneers were unsavory persons. All criminals are unsavory persons. No criminals are pioneers. So what I do, when I go to standard form, I do it like this. I hope you can see this because I don't have a blackboard. But I make a P, I put the content in there, like no pioneers were unsavory persons. And then I put the P, the M, the S, and the M, like that. I put little brackets around those. And that's how I move into this. There's where we're moving, is this. So it turns into an EAE 2. Okay? EAE 2. Because E, this is an E, that's an A, that's an E. And the fact that the middle term is here makes it into figure 2. You have to memorize those 4 figures. The 4 figures are based on the positioning of the middle term. So then you diagram it. Now you diagram the 2 premises and you look to see if the conclusion is already diagrammed. In this case, the E is universal and the A is universal, so you can do either one first. But always remember, if there's a universal and a particular, do the universal first. So no P is M. No P is M. So just look at the P's and the M's and cross out all the P's that are M's. That's why I crossed out all the P's that are M's. You see that? All the P's that are M's, I crossed those out. All the P's. That's an S that's an M, but it's also a P. So I crossed that out too. I crossed those out. No P is M. So I have to cross out all the P's that are at the same time P's and M's. If it's an S, I still cross it out because that's an S, that's a P, that's an M. So I cross that out too. You see you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 realms. That realm right there is where S, P, and M all interlock. Okay, so then all S is M. All S is M. So that means there's no S that's not an M. So I have to cross out all the S's that are not M's. That's this space. And then look at the conclusion. No S is P. Well, all the S's that are P's are crossed out. So the conclusion's already diagrammed. So that means it's valid. Okay. But I don't think it's sound because I know that some pioneers were criminals. So I would, but that's not what we're dealing with here. But I do want to keep on going back to that because that's important. When you're evaluating arguments, it's really important whether or not the propositions are true or not. But what we're working on now is just determining whether or not the reasoning process is correct. Let's just do one more. I wanted to do one that's invalid. Here's one that's invalid. On page 205, number 8 is invalid. Number 8 says, some Christians are not Methodists, for some Christians are not Protestants, and some Protestants are not Methodists. So now That's sort of it. It's almost in standard form. So we need to go from that into standard form. And then from standard form, we want to go to symbolic form. From that, we're going to test by using, now this one illustrates something that's important. And that's why you need to do some practice. Sometimes the X, when you remember S and O propositions use an X to diagram, right? Sometimes the X goes on the line. And when it does that, it can be either on one side or the other. I use this expression, intolerably ambiguous. Sometimes things are intolerably ambiguous. What that means, ambiguity is not a bad thing for me. It just means things have more than one meaning. That's fine. I'm a pluralist at heart. I like things that have more than one meaning. That's all art is more than one meaning. But when you're dealing with logic, there are intolerable ambiguities. So what that means is it could be on one side, it can be on the other side. If that's the case, usually it's invalid. I don't know if it's always invalid. I have to ask a logician or think about that a little more. But it's usually, if there's a possibility that the X is not in the right place, then it's invalid. Okay, because we're dealing with precision here in logic. So if I say some Christians are not Methodists, for some Christians are not Protestants and some Protestants are not Methodists, that turns into an I1. And how do I know that? Well, I have to find the conclusion. The conclusion is some Christians are not Methodists. So Methodist is the predicate term of the conclusion, and Christians is the subject term. So whatever other proposition contains Methodist is going to be your major premise. And the next sentence, the next clause, for some Christians are not, the last clause, some Protestants are not Methodists, is, oh, wait, I didn't do that. I went right. I did it in a hurry and I didn't do it right. Oh, where's my pen? So some Christians are not Methodists. Some Christians are not Methodists is your conclusion. So some S is not P is the conclusion. And then you find, okay, so Methodist is the predicate term of the conclusion. You have to find the other proposition that contains the word Methodist in it. So that is, some Protestants are not Methodists. And then there's only one proposition. Then you find the some Protestants are not Methodists is, and then Protestants. Some Christians are not Protestants. Okay, so Methodist is your predicate term, Protestant is your middle term, and Christians is your subject term. So it turns into some M is not P, some S is not M, some S is not P. So that turns into an O, 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 1. Because the major premise is an O, minor premise is an O, and the conclusion is an O, and the middle term is on an angle like the beginning of a W, so that makes it figure 1. So then you can diagram the O1. So you make your 3 circles. When you make your 3 circles, it always has to be like this. Just make your 3 circles and put S there, P there, and M there. Always has to be that way. So if I say some M is not P, I just look at the M's and P's. Some M is not P. you see, I had to put that X on that line right there because these are M's, these are P's. And the statement says some M is not P. So if I put it on the line, that means it could be here because here's an M that's not a P, but it could be over here too. This is the trickiest part of the syllogism. Once you get this, if you can do everything else, and then you get this about the line, about when it goes on the line, then you've mastered it. So the X could be over here too, because that's an M that's not a P, but it's also an S, but it doesn't matter. It's an M that's not a P, and that's what it says. So if the statement says some M is not P, it might be here and it might be there. So that's intolerably ambiguous. So that's why I have to put it on the line. And then let's diagram the minor premise. Some S is not M. Some S, so there's an S that's not an M. There's an S, well, that's not an M. So do you see, that has to be on the line also, the S, because it's an S, if it were over here, it's an S that's not an M. If it's over here, it's an S that's not an M. It's also a P, but it doesn't matter. It's still an S. It's still an S that's not an M. So it might be over here, and it might be over there. There's another intolerable ambiguity. So this X could be here, it could be there. So we put it on the line. This X could be there, we put it on the line. Okay? This is the trickiest part. You have to think, this is going to tax your thinking. You have to think. The statement says some M is not P. So here's an M that's not a P, but there's an M that's not a P. So where do I put the line? Where do I put the X? I have to put it on the line. If I say some S is not P, well, it could be here. Here's an S that's not a P. No, wait, here's an S. Some S is not M, I mean. If I say some S is not M, here's an S that's not an M. And here's an S that's not an M, so it has to be on that line because it could be here and it could be there. Now, what is the whole method, the main point I was telling you about? You diagram the two premises, and you always do the universal one first. In this case, they're both particular because we're dealing with an O1, and O's are all particular. But if there was an E or an A in there, we'd have to do that one first. Always do the universal proposition first when you diagram. So what's the whole method? You diagram the major and minor premise. If the conclusion is already diagrammed, after you diagram the major and minor premise, then it's valid. If it's not, it's invalid. Okay, so look to the conclusion. Some S is not P. Some S is not P. See, the fact that that S could be there makes it invalid. Because if it were there, that would be an S that's a P. And that contradicts the conclusion. The conclusion says some S is not P. That'd be fine if this X were here. But since it's on the line, that means there's a possibility that it could be here. If it's there, that means there's a possibility that that S is a P. But that's not what the conclusion says. The conclusion says some S is not P. There exists at least one X such that X is not P, such that S is not P. But if it were here, there exists at least one S such that S is P. And that can't be. So the very fact that there's a possibility that there's an S that's also a P, well, that there's a Christian that's not a, how is it? Christian that's not a Methodist. Okay, so this is the whole process. It's not the whole process. For the whole process, we need chapter 7. But for now, what I wanted you to learn in this lecture is how to, let me simplify it all because I said a lot. You find the conclusion of an argument, and then you find the predicate term of the conclusion. And whatever other proposition contains that, that's going to be your major premise. Then you find the subject term of the conclusion. Whatever proposition contains that, it's your minor premise. And then the other term is the middle term. And then you name the figure and mood of that. And the way we talked about that already, you name the first letter. It's going to be an A, E, I, or an O. That's going to be your major premise. Second letter is your minor premise. The third letter is always your conclusion. Then you draw these three circles and diagram the two premises. If the conclusion is already diagrammed, it's valid. If it's not, it's invalid. But there's a lot that went into that. You have to know how to take like adverbial clauses and turn them into categories. Like when I said music, I mean all music, so it turns it into an A. I don't mean some music. So you take phrases that can be it could be like beautiful, things that are beautiful. Beautiful sunrises elevate people's moods. Let's just say that. So the beautiful is an adjective. So now you have to turn it into a category, like all things that are beautiful. So you take adjectival phrases and adverbial phrases, turn them into categories, and then you have to determine whether or not they're A, E, I, or O propositions. That's what takes practice. But those exercises on page 204 and 205, they're almost in standard form. But the word, any form of the verb to be, that's not part of the categories. That's called the copula. And the word no, or all, or some are not, those are not part of the categories either. The category is just a class of things. Okay? And then the other trickiest part is knowing when to put it on the line. The way to test that is, if you have a proposition, so some S is P, and if you put it over here, it's an S that's a P. Okay, but what if I put it over here? It's an S that it's a P, but it's also an M. So how do I know if there's no way of knowing where to put it? Then you have to put it on the line. If it says some S is P and the M's are all crossed out, then you don't put it on the line. You can't put the X on the line if one side of the line is crossed out. Like in this one, for example, if this side of the line were crossed out, if that were crossed out and it said some S is not M, then is not P, it would have to go here because I can't put it there. It's crossed out. So if it's already crossed out, then it can't be, you can't put an X over top of anything that's crossed out. Okay, because then, okay, so it just takes practice. That's why you have to do problems. You have to do the exercises. It's no different than learning a skill with your body, like a sport, some skill in sports. You surely can't become, a soccer player by reading books on soccer or music or anything. This is a skill. Whenever you're dealing with skills, you have to do exercises and then check your exercise, see if you did it right. If you did it wrong, that's how you learn, by the way. It took me too long to learn that. Like sometimes I'm even happy when my dog makes a mistake, so that way I know he's learning. It's hard. It's a hard lesson to learn. It took me like 50 years to get that one. It's better when you make mistakes when you're learning, because what happens is you correct your mistake And then in that correction, you don't make it again. Or you have to tell yourself not to make the same mistake, and then you get better. If you keep on doing something that's easy and you get it right, get it right, get it right, then something comes out of left field and you don't know how to deal with it because you've never made a mistake. So it's better to make a mistake. I know that's hard because you end up not getting good grades sometimes. Like I learned how to put the X on the line after I screwed up my first logic test. I'll never, I mastered that. I went back, thought, oh my God, I messed up my whole test, screwed up my whole grade because I don't know how to put the X on the line. So I went and fixed that. Now I know how to do that. Now I'll never make that mistake again. So you end up, that's how you learn. So the only way you can do that without losing something is practice. And you make a mistake and you fix it. And then when it mistakes, and then you get into some trial where it's more important not to make a mistake. You've made the mistake, you fixed it, you know how not to make the mistake, and you get better. So that's an important thing I just said. It's a hard one to accept because usually we do things. So the way to get around that is always challenge yourself. Once you mastered a certain level, make it harder on yourself. Just make it harder, raise the bar. Make it a little more difficult. And always make it more difficult, more difficult. Then those things that were so hard, they're simple. But if you don't keep raising the bar, you don't get any better. At most, you'll get just mediocre. You'll get good at it, but you won't be great. So if you want to be great, raise the bar. And the first thing to do is do the exercises. If you just read about it, you're not going to get anywhere. All right, so those are my old man words of advice. All right, we'll do the rules method next time. That starts on page 205.